What has worked in large organizations is to set up parallel, simplified governance structures to enable innovation to happen easily. In the early stages, one of the biggest challenges for the companies is connecting their innovators. A good signal that organization is genuinely trying to innovate is that you have frustration. Because if people are not frustrated, then it's either, just a PR exercise, so nobody is frustrated because they're focused on the perception of them, and then they're not really concerned about succeeding in the market. You have that long period of time that can be between 3 to 7 years where you're wrestling with everybody, and then at the very end, it's gonna be, oh, this is great. And to endure this middle part, you need passion.
All right, welcome back everyone to a new episode of Business Unbound. Every week I sit down with exceptional practitioners who share how they actually think about the most consequential matters in their domain. We explore the mental models, frameworks, and instincts they have developed over the course of their careers. You get what took them decades to build in one conversation. And you leave with sharper thinking for the decisions you face. I'm your host, Florian Hoff. Today, I'm joined by Bruno Pesec. Bruno is the president of Pesec Global and one of the more thoughtful operators working on how large organizations actually build innovation capability rather than just announce it. His background actually spans mechanical engineering, which I find interesting, lean process improvement, in-house innovation, system design, and advisory work with senior leaders on governance, portfolio management, and execution. That mix is actually highly relevant because he has seen the problem from both sides, inside organizations trying to make innovation work, and outside them diagnosing why it usually does not work the way it's supposed to. His view, you will learn, is blunt and earned. Innovation failure is rarely an ideas problem and far more often a management problem, which makes his perspective especially useful for anyone responsible for growth under uncertainty. In this conversation, Bruno and I will get into how he reads the system behind the rhetoric, including the early signals that tell him whether a company is serious about innovation or simply better at describing it. We will explore how leaders should fund uncertain bets without demanding false certainty too early or drifting into undisciplined spending, and what good tranche-based decision-making requires in practice. We will discuss portfolio judgment, including why strategy is often weakened less by lack of opportunity than by an inability to decide what not to pursue. And finally, we will examine the tension between accountability on the one hand and bureaucracy on the other hand. So really how to create enough structure for disciplined learning without building a process that suffocates the very thing it is supposed to support. This is Business Unbound. Let's dive in. Bruno Pesec, welcome to Business Unbound.
I'm so happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation today.
So am I. And Bruno, to set the scene for people listening who may know the problem and maybe they don't know the work that you're involved with, can you explain what are you spending most of your time right now and what are the kinds of institutional problems that you tend to solve?
Innovation in a business context, not necessarily social innovation, environmental innovation, etc. When companies set out to innovate, they're trying to do so to make lives easier for their customers and to improve their business performance. That's pretty simple. Now, the issue with large enterprises is they often have a lot of external pressure on you must be innovative, internal pressure, we really must innovate. And then leaders under such pressure, they tend to use shortcuts or ways to satisfy this pressure that does not necessarily help them actually achieve innovation results. That is what I focus on. That is where I enter. I primarily work with leaders that are interested in having results from innovation, not just innovation theater or being perceived as innovative, but actually innovate. And that is, as you said in the introduction, that doesn't have so much to do with ideas themselves, but rather how are ideas managed, invested, funded in the organization at scale. But we'll get to that in time. So that is kind of my focus. In general, I work with larger enterprises because small companies, startups, etc., they have different set of problems. they usually have one product, one strategy, one customer, one focus. So the set of issues they encounter is mostly, how do we innovate this little product? How do we bring it to the market? How do we make customer happy? But for large enterprises, they have multiple focuses. They have multiple initiatives and strategies competing for attention. So a set of problems that they're facing is very different from what SMEs and the startups are facing. And there has been this evolution over the last, well, I will say almost 20 years now, when we had the revelation that, hey, startups are not a smaller versions of big companies. And now we are making a full circle where we are saying, okay, companies are not a bigger version of startup.
Arguably, that's true. And you have worked across advisory roles and inside large organizations as well, where you have been involved in designing innovation systems. And I believe this gives you a rare comparative vantage point on a problem that many senior leaders actually face. And I mean, the gap between saying innovation matters and actually funding and governing it in a way that produces the results. So from that vantage point where you're sitting, what have you learned to notice early that tells you whether an organization is genuinely set up to innovate or merely to talk about it more professionally?
Yes. So there are several telltale signals that innovation might or might not be happening. And I usually pay attention to what I call the whole vertical slice, or as you said, from the vantage point looking of everything. Because what's important is not just to hear what just the leaders or frontline innovators are saying. You have to listen and pay attention to all of them to understand what is the real situation. A good signal that organization is genuinely trying to innovate is that you have frustrations. Because if people are not frustrated, then it's either just a PR exercise, so nobody is frustrated because they're focused on the perception of them, and then they're not really concerned about succeeding in the market. That's a good signal. So frustrations usually in leaders are, the ideas that my people are bringing forward, they're not big enough. The ideas they're bringing, they're not maybe relevant. The ideas they're working on, they're going too slow. So that's from the leader perspective. And then when I go to the innovators and I start hearing, we have all these ideas, but they're not accepting. We have these ideas, but they're not providing the right resources. I have an idea, but I have difficulty getting it through the organization. All of this that some might say, oh, wow, these are red flags. I don't consider them red flags. I consider them signals that people are trying to do something. They're genuinely trying to innovate and they're running into problems. These problems are solvable. We can fix them. We can improve the organization. But what is very, very difficult to fix is if there is no drive, if there is no interest to attempt to innovate at all. Because people frustrated means someone genuinely cares. Because you're only frustrated when you care. If you don't care, then it's like, oh, I tried, it didn't go. I'm moving on with my life. That is very difficult to work with. Because for innovation to succeed, you do need several passionate people, because innovation work is very, very difficult. And sometimes it is very unrewarding. Like that whole middle part where you're trying to bring something to life can be very unrewarding because you're fighting at the same time the market, the competition, and internal organization. Because a part of the organization is not going to put big trust in your innovation team or even the leader backing it until we see it. We'll believe it when we see it. So you have that long period of time that can be between 3 to 7 years where you're wrestling with everybody. And then at the very end, it's going to be, oh, this is great. And to endure this middle part, you need passion. Or at least I haven't found any other emotion that will help people in that middle part.
You know what you're explaining? I find this fascinating. I think you're the first person that I'm talking to on this podcast who says that frustration is something good in the extent that is a signal that there is actually something happening. But let me ask a direct follow-up question and turn this around a little bit. Have you ever encountered an organization where innovation was there, where they actually produced results, but the corporate culture was so great that there was no frustration at all?
I'm thinking, no, I haven't, because there is in a large organization, there is always a little bit of friction. If it's not frustration with the process, it is, why are they doing it? That's my turn. So there's always a little bit of that happening. When you have sufficiently large organization, what starts happening is, at least in the European context, because organizations are trying to attract talent, and there is fight for talent in Scandinavia, in Europe, etc. And in addition to offering good salaries, good compensation packages, companies are also offering inflated titles. So you will have titles, innovation director of the cosmos, innovation director of this and that, and people take those titles seriously. So then you suddenly have an organization that is wide, and somebody is working on an innovative idea, and somebody else in the organization perceives, oh, why are they working on this? I should be working. So there's always this little tit for tat. Even the organizations that are publicly considered to be most innovative, when I was in them, there is always this dissatisfaction, frustration, tension, and it is important to distinguish between, or not to distinguish, but there's a thin line between that heading into toxicity and that being healthy frustration. And I'll jump to the example of sports. Like if anybody is doing either competitive sports, group sports, individual sports, you always have to have this little bit of dissatisfaction with your own performance in order to do better. Every training you want to do better. Every run you want to do better. Every exercise you want to do better. Every play you want to do a little bit better. If you're completely complacent and satisfied with everything, then there is no this internal motivation to do slightly better. Similar thinking can be applied to the workplace environment, but it is, I would even say, onus on the leaders to be careful not to take that into toxic competition, where everybody tramples over everybody else. Here, I have seen in different cultural contexts. For example, Scandinavian context is pretty flat. So there isn't a very, very deep hierarchies. They're relatively flat. And even between those layers, power differentiator is not huge. So it is more, let's say, socially acceptable to have, people talking to each other regardless of their rank. If you go a little bit south, if you go into some German companies or Spanish companies, etc., or French companies, you will sometimes see that the power difference between organization layers can be quite high, where executive layer might be, why are you talking to me? Write to my assistant. If you want to reach me, if you want my help, go through 3 levels of assistance and we book a meeting a quarter from now. And all these things, they tie into this phenomenon that you're asking about. There are many elements to it, but paying attention to this level of toxicity and how everything interrelates. I know it might sound easy when I say it, like that, but it is something that is worth observing and being attentive to.
And what do these different levels of hierarchy actually do to innovation? If you compare, let's say, the Scandinavian culture in the workplace versus German or Spanish ones, be careful here, I'm German. What does it do to innovation?
Yeah, well, bureaucracy in general is hurtful to innovation, but maybe not in the way that people usually think about it, because usual narrative is bureaucracy bad, kill bureaucracy, destroy everything. What my position is that bureaucracy and a lot of measures that we consider bureaucratic are a form of defense against organizational trauma. Something went bad, therefore we instituted a rule so that doesn't happen again. I work a lot with highly regulated companies in financial sector, in medical sector, and similar sectors. There they have a lot of regulations, and it's easy to say, this is red tape, this is killing innovation, etc. But a lot of these measures are put in place to, to prevent another financial crisis, to prevent from people dying because of pharma not testing something in time. So there are a lot of security measures there. And yes, they do make innovation sometimes difficult. And yes, some of the measures don't make sense. So it's easy to hate on bureaucracy. When it comes to innovation, I mean, it should be pretty straightforward that number one should always be do no harm. So that you shouldn't need a law or governance for that. That should be always the operating principle. But for larger companies, what is the best way, because it is unrealistic that you're going to wake up one day and throw the whole rule book through the window and say, from today, we are writing new rules from the zero up. That's completely unrealistic. What has worked in large organizations is to set up parallel, simplified governance structures to enable innovation to happen easier. Because what is in the early stages, one of the biggest challenges for the companies is connecting their innovators to the right resources. Again, this is a very specific to enterprise problem. This is not something that necessarily startups or SMEs have, because if you have a 100-person company, pretty much everybody knows everybody, even if they are not friends or have strong relationships, but everybody knows everybody. In a large enterprise, you might have an idea and I might be the person with resources, but we might be geographically separated, visionally separated. We might be in completely different business units. Even though we are working in the same company, it might be very difficult for Florian to reach Bruno to have a conversation about developing this idea. So a separate, simplified governance structure, which has, well, we sometimes call it venture boards, some companies call it innovation, growth boards, not committees, that do have some budget and decision-making authority, can short circuit that. Because usually what innovators need, they need access to either procurement, sales, IT, legal, etc. And then making those connections allows the support units to act as enablers rather than defenders. I will not call them blockers. I call them defenders because a lot of units that are usually considered, oh, they're the innovation killers, the great blockers, like CFO, financial directors, business controllers, procurement, legal, they always shoot down our ideas. They shoot them down because their job is to defend the company from financial risk and other forms of risk. So any governance that you set up should allow direct connection with those professionals to have them as a part of your innovation development process so that you're handling all these forms of risk as you're developing ideas. And remember earlier how I mentioned vertical slice. This is the healthiest way to think about setting this parallel governance structure, because it shouldn't be horizontal. It should be vertical. So from the top management to the innovators, it should be few people from every layer. And this is connected to another phenomenon, that is innovation in large enterprises. If you're thinking professionals, functions, etc., there's a risk if they are too similar to what everybody is doing, they will get ignored. But if they're too alien from what everyone is doing, they're going to get rejected. So it's a balancing act between being different enough, but not different too much to be able to persist and exist in the organization. And that is why this vertical slice is important, because you will have a selection from top management to the front line that is kind of on the edge and is slowly pulling the organization, and everybody is following. So similar, not too dissimilar, and not too similar. It is a weird balancing act. And all of this comes together. And this might sound like a lot from the perspective, but really once it's put in place, it is few simple things. You have a small board, you have people bringing ideas, and you help them develop it. That's what it is at a nutshell. The problem is if you try to make that too big, overburdening. If you create a committee, if you start demanding things, if you write whole rule books for that, then you're back into, reintegrating the approach with the mother organization, and then everything starts, buckling under the weight and under the pressure of the systems that you're introducing. I'll pause here for a moment.
And this is interesting, right? Now, assume that everything that you said is true, right? You have an organization where they have this vertical slicing. There's like a lean and direct line between the innovators and the management. There's an appropriate degree of, challenge and let's say freedom to act. There's a good balance between this. Do you know, or are you aware of examples where all of this, what you explained, was in place, but the organization was still not able to effectively carry out innovation processes?
I'm thinking this is not, I will not answer with a simple yes or no. I have several cases where everything is in place, and we have to think about it as a sinusoid, ups and downs. There are moments when there's a lot of organizational energy and momentum. Everybody is into it. And that might last for, few years. Then there's a doldrum. The energy slowly dissipates. People change, positions change, organizational champion might change because they switch role or new strategic priorities, etc. So everything goes in a little bit of down. Then new energy comes and goes up. I've been working with one client for almost eight years now. They have multiple business units, and I've been helping them throughout their journey. Of course, I'm not the only one. It's a large conglomerate, so they're using a lot of external help, a lot of internal help, and I've seen this evolve. It would start. There will be a lot of energy in the beginning, and then a few years later, markets change, priorities change, but they continue. They continue with the structures. They continue working. They continue paying attention to opportunities. Then new energy comes, and that is used and leveraged again. What I have observed is very important for these structures staying in place, and I'm okay with that. I'm actually in favor of that. Is they need to produce results, and that's what I keep saying. Like, for corporate innovation, yes, absolutely, we need to see new revenue. Yes, we need to see increased profit margin. Yes, we need to see increased market share. Otherwise, what are we innovating for? Just to maintain status quo? I mean, investing in innovation is one of the highest risks that you can take as a leader, because there's a high probability that any idea that you invest in might fail. That is just a reality of something being considered innovative. Because if it's certain, how can you claim it's innovating? For something to be innovative, it has to be new and it has to create value. If it's new, then by its very virtue of being novel, it has to have some uncertainty, either in the way you're going to develop it or how customers are going to accept it. So there's always a risk for leaders backing and investing in any innovative initiative to lose money, lose talent, and lose reputation. We have to consider that. So anything that has such risk must have outsized returns. So when we look at these structures that we described moments ago, the best ones among them, within a couple of years, they generate results in short term in terms of potential market that they're entering and in initial early signals that this market is responding. Because this very much depends on the industry, but sometimes it can take from 3 to 7 years before actual products and services are sold in the market at the scale that makes financial returns that are relevant to the organization. And why I keep saying this relevant and relative words is because for a SME, developing a business line that is 100 million euros in annual recurring revenue might be absolutely awesome. For a large enterprise or conglomerate, that might not even make a difference on their P&L statement. And this relativity is very important when assessing the quality and relevance of your own investments in innovation, because putting a lot of money to create something too small for your organization might not be worth it. So when we look at these programs, all the best clients I've worked with, they were able to generate meaningful results for them within a couple of years. That will usually look in a sense of creating a new product line that still hasn't been tapped into. And that usually initially brings in several million euros, which is not huge for big companies, but is enough to fund the development of that idea further. And what all of the best programs had in common is that these initial millions, they're just tip of the iceberg. All of them were creating opportunities in billions. So they were just getting into it. And that is important for long-term investment for larger enterprises. Again, if I'm putting in a lot of money to develop new business lines, new products, new services, to enter a market, that market should be sizable enough because one, we are never going to have all of it. Two, the moment we confirm the market, competitors are going to enter because we did the education of the customer, proof of concept, and everything. So everybody sees that people are interested in buying this. And third, first mover advantage is not as big as everybody thinks. So all these three things are acting all the time. Gonna stop now for a moment.
Maybe, Bruno, you have perhaps a concrete example. It sounds sensible what you explain, but I think for the benefit of our audience members, it would add a lot of value if you had like a concrete example without saying names, of course, but maybe there is a case where you can say, okay, this is how it started. This is where the first millions came in. This was the product. And then it developed to something bigger. Can you
Okay.
talk us through something
Yes.
concrete?
Yes. Just scrutinizing it in my head. Okay. Large enterprise, multiple business units. This
Which
is
industry?
relevant. This is relevant. Sorry?
Which industry?
Let's say industrial. I will not go into more. So industrial. They're doing with industrial products. It's not software. It's not service, but industrial. So old school, where innovation is difficult. Hardware is involved. So it is one business unit that does with a subset of that industrial domain. They have been seeing for years diminishing in their market share because this specific industrial has been offering bundled products and services. That means that everything what they were selling was in one big contract, and you as a customer would get either that whole big contract that was absolutely massive, or you would get nothing. Now, over the decades, competition has been debundled. Competition has been offering smaller parts of that big bundle that they have been offering, so they have been successfully stealing away customers from them who were interested. Hey, I just need that part, or I just need that part. I don't need the whole thing. So a lot of pressure from the outside. At the same time, there was not a huge amount of pressure internally, because even though they've been losing market share to competitors, it has still been a widely successful business. And this is actually common. You will hear in a lot of cases, you need a burning platform. That's nonsense. You do not need a burning platform. If you have a burning platform, you're in a very bad state to innovate, because innovation is uncertain. The best time to innovate is when you're in a good financial shape and when you can afford to lose a little bit of money on innovation. Anyway, that was the situation for this big company. This business unit decided we want to actively invest in shaping the future agenda. How do we do that? This is where we step in. This is where we start shaping. Okay, what are you trying to achieve as a business unit? What's your top priorities? Now let's make those top priorities explicit for innovation agenda. How to your business priorities is innovation going to contribute? Let's be specific. I will not go into specific examples from their strategy, a lot of NDAs, but what I can tell you is how we structured it. So we took their business targets that were for the whole business units, and we went through them one by one. And here it's pretty standard metrics, revenue increase, revenue growth, margins, etc. Very, very standard, nothing nuclear, nothing special. And we went through each one of those and said, okay, to which of those do we want our innovation efforts to contribute? And we will not accept to everything. Innovation is better suitable for specific targets. I usually am in favor of connecting innovation to revenue growth, margin increase, because usually if you're talking about innovative solutions, they will have higher profit margin than core solutions because they're novel, so we can build premium for it. But I'm digressing. So we went through that. Then the next stage was, okay, we have that. Now let's define the type of innovations we will not invest in. And let's structure that by types of technology that we're not interested in, by types of business models that we're not interested in. And this is very important because I'm using example from another industry. In the financial services, one client said, we are not interested in investing in anything that includes opening new branches. Very simple. They were saying, we're digitizing. We are not investing if we have to open 12 new branches. We're not investing in that idea. So similar logic was here. What kind of technologies don't we want to invest in? We have R&Ds that are dealing with bleeding edge technologies. We're talking about innovation. And then we took that to the next step. Okay, we must be specific. Now we know where innovation wants to contribute and what we do not want to invest in. Let's be specific around which type of investments we are interested in. Again, from the problems perspective, from the business model perspective, from the technology perspective. Why this document is important is because it tells everybody in the organization what type of ideas are welcome. So they allow pre-selection from the people, bringing them forward. That was the framing. Then the next thing was, okay, we have that, but we have to kickstart the organization to start generating ideas to bring them forward. Usually business units, even in conglomerates that are distributed, they have several, let's say, home offices, either in the headquarters or somewhere geologically. My proposal, and in this specific example, is whatever kickstart you do, get people together. invest in it. Those few flight tickets, hotel stays, it's not going to bankrupt the company, but it's going to kickstart the process so much. So in this case, we had already the strategic framing, as I described, and we created the kickstart together with the client, where we brought around 30 people together in the same room for several days to work on the ideas. They have proposed ideas beforehand, and I will describe here. When we talk about business ideas, we're not really talking about thoughts. Like, thoughts is something unfinished that people just spit out. A business idea specifically says, who is it for? What is it about? What is the benefit for that customer? And what is the benefit for the organization? It doesn't have to be detailed business plan, but every idea needs to be answered to answer these basic questions. Otherwise, we cannot evaluate it at all. Like, what do I do if I don't have that information? So we got the people in the room, kickstarted developing their ideas. And this is more about just, reframing, rephrasing, and kind of polishing so they can start working. Every idea, and this is important to consider if you, dear listener, will do something similar. One of the big mistakes people do is they separate the idea from the person proposing. Or they may say, these 4 ideas, they sound similar, so let's put them together. That's a horrible mistake, even if they sound similar, because, as I said, developing ideas is painful. So when you merge those ideas, you dissolve accountability. So if Bruno, Florian, and 2 other colleagues, we had 4 ideas and now they're 1, I will feel, this is just 1/4 my idea. It's not really what Florian has described. That doesn't resonate with me, but to somebody else, it sounded similar. Remember, when we are first time articulating idea, there's so much more in our heads than we're able to put on paper. And if we have dissolved this accountability and ownership, then neither of the 4 of us is going to have the same drive to suffer for the next few months to develop it. And I have seen that again and again and again. These teams are set up with merged ideas and they never lead to anything because people disengage quite quickly, because those initial stages of developing idea are very, very challenging in a sense of work, because we need to test the main assumptions quickly. And that can be very awkward, especially for engineers and people who don't have a lot of experience being wrong in front of the customer.
Bruno, then explain to me, please. Assume that 4 individuals, they are all motivated, they are all driven, and they all have not the same, but a similar idea and leadership beliefs. They may all have some intrinsic value. Which one of these 4 to back?
All 4.
All 4.
All 4. So let's continue on that, then I'll go back. When you set up the governance and the strategic filters, the best way is to let the ideas flow and let them self-select. Because if you have 4 and these 4 all have a sound idea that are aligned with the strategy, innovation strategy, and what you're really funding is that first step, first few weeks or first few months, depending on what they're asking for. So they're going to get the funding in terms of money, talent, organizational connections to do their first step. That's it. That shouldn't be a problem to fund for all 4 of them. And then you will see, I'm guaranteeing over time, 3 of them are going to simply drop off because of the nature of innovation. But let's assume that all 4 get through. Amazing. I mean, you have now 4 ideas that are relevant for the organization and they have some sort of potential. Keep on developing them. As they mature, they might intertwine naturally through the collaboration and development rather than artificially at the beginning. It's like you're similar, let's join you at the hip. So I would not say forbid them from collaborating, but don't force. If you imagine, I like to say, let ideas flow, and I use this flow as imagine a river. If you put a little rowboat and it goes down, or if it passes all the obstacles, good, congratulations, little boat. And the same is here. I would let all 4 of them go. You're similar. I would tell them, you're similar, speak to each other, exchange ideas, exchange insights. And then if they come to me and say, hey, Bruno, I think we should merge our initiatives. Good, no problem. But I don't want to do it the other way around because it's premature. And not a lot, but the healthiest innovation systems, they switch this power dynamic. It is not innovation board. It's not executives telling their people, this is how you will do it. It's the people coming and proposing, this is what we want to do next. Can you please fund that? They might come, they might propose merger. They might come, they might propose stoppage. They might say, hey, we've been working on this for 3 months. This does not look promising. We propose to stop this idea and to focus on something else. So that is a subtle but very valuable shift. Does that make sense, what I shared?
It does, and I'm wondering a little bit, you explained, okay, start with the first 4 ideas or whatever and let them run for a few weeks and for a month until they reach the stage of, okay, more support is required, more resources, more investment. Help me understand the cognitive process when a leadership team is deciding to release this next tranche of support. What are the specific things that they should be waiting besides, okay, effort or senior sponsorship or enthusiasm, perhaps?
Yeah. In this framework, some hate this term, but I think it's pretty fine term. But stage gates, in agile, some people would be strongly against stage gates, etc. What I will say is that what's different in innovation funnels, stage gate models, call them however you want, is that these checkpoints, they're not watertight doors. In traditional product development, we must satisfy all the requirements for a specific stage. When we satisfy them, we move on. And this is cut off. There is no going back. In innovation, we will define, okay, there are specific requirements that the idea and innovation team must meet. And if they meet them, they can move on. But we must also leave the possibility, if through their discovery work, they find out that something they thought was true is wrong, that they can regress backwards to the previous stage. Now, the thinking, the cognition here is, as a leader on innovation, growth board, venture board, whatever, my job is to make a yes or no decision. And I'm making that yes or no investment decision based on what the innovation team is proposing. So it is their job to convince me that their idea is worth further investing in. They can do so by sharing with me signals from the market that their idea is working. They can do so by sharing the work they did on feasibility. Is it technologically possible? Can we build it? Should we buy it? Etc. All these questions. Now, I'm being a little bit abstract here because for every idea and for every organization, this is going to be different. For the industrial that we started as an example, we specified at each stage what are the bare minimum requirements that the team should demonstrate so that we are confident in, okay, we can give further investment. And what's that level of investment? Now, it's important to think these investments, they're not really linear. They're more like exponential, because initial months are going to be very, very small investments. But once we reach what might sometimes be called the product market fit, we're really talking about large investments to scale the whole operation. But the quickest time to kill ideas is in those early stages. And that's why I said, like, four people coming with an ideas, let them through. Because if I just spend 10,000 euros to kill 3 out of 4 ideas, that's great. It's better than spending 4 millions and then learning later that, hey, this is not really worth investing in. The biggest cognitive shift for leaders is that you switch to that mode. Okay, I am being presented evidence, and now I need to gauge that evidence together with the signal to decide, am I funding the next step? Yes or no? And this switches it dramatically, because they're used to, okay, we have big plans with big budgets. And my job as a leader is to, follow up on that quarterly or annually, depending on the size of project, and telling everybody, okay, this is how you do, these are the action plans, etc. This switches it dramatically, because suddenly you have smaller packets, and you have people coming and they're the ones proposing the next decision. So they're switching. I'm not proposing decisions anymore. I'm approving decisions. And this is, again, a small but significant shift that's relevant for innovation work. Otherwise, executives just don't have that much time. And you need a lot of ideas. You can't have executives deciding on hundreds of ideas where they need to propose decision for each one of those. That's unrealistic. You will not get a good portfolio balance that way. That's why we have to switch this dynamic. So the executive time is used for the most important task of yes or no, fund more, fund less. And we move that decision-making capability to the front line, by which we also develop them as professionals. So they start thinking also more broadly, not just, my niche, but kind of how does my idea, how does my work impact the business at large? So it's win-win-win.
And assume that an organization is doing this, right? The people that do the innovations, they also think about this from a broader sense and a business sense, and a new decision gets posted to the innovation board. I would argue that probably one of the harder moves for any senior leader is to not choosing that they want to support, but instead to say, okay, we ignore this, or we stop this, or maybe we never begin a certain initiative. Because as we all know, strategy is often diluted by too many worthy initiatives, shiny object syndrome, instead of too few. So how do you think about portfolio judgment in a way that actually helps leaders distinguish between this is a healthy optionality we want to pursue and maybe other options which are just distraction from the core strategy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is, we can help leaders only so far. So part of the answer is them maturing and becoming simply more confident in their insights, etc. What we usually do is we can structure the portfolio in a certain way to highlight things, and that is the painful upside of adopting a portfolio approach, is that you start surfacing all those initiatives, and some of them will become painfully obvious that why are we still doing this? Why does this still exist? So sometimes there is downside to adopting this approach because it surfaces tough conversations. But that is exactly what we want to have. Portfolio can be structured in multiple ways. What I found works best is considering the type of the innovation initiative. Usually here people resonate the most, I guess it's because of HBR articles, so it's quite spread out, is that core, adjacent, transformational types of innovation. So core is something that's very similar to what we are doing. It's basically serving the same customer and similar products. And then adjacent is either new customer, same products, or the same customer, new products. And then transformational might be both. So that makes it easy to immediately distinguish the type of innovation risk. And then the other one is if the company is using some sort of stage gate or maturity model or something similar. So we have type of innovation and maturity. And with those two parameters, we can quickly see, okay, what is the risk profile of every initiative? If we also include the information about revenue potential of each of those initiatives, executives and leaders can at glance judge, okay, this is how my portfolio looks like. Now, about the balancing of the portfolio, this is purely a strategic decision. So if a company says, we want 10% of our investments to be of more radical nature, then the portfolio will tell them immediately. If everything is concentrated along the core and there's nothing in that transformational, they immediately know, oh my, we are not investing and supporting according to our investment thesis. On the other side, if they say, we want to just have 60% of core investments, and then again, everything is concentrated elsewhere, it tells them something. So it's informational tool portfolio, but it by itself, it doesn't drive behavioral change. It simply enables conversation about it that will help drive this. Because what drives behavioral change more is the willingness of the management to change their priorities. And that is what you mentioned. In a lot of cases, leaders will have 1 to 2 pet projects, in a lack of better words, where no matter what type of investigation is done, what type of experimentation is done, they will still believe in it and they will still want to invest in it. Portfolio enables leadership team to have a conversation around that. Like, look, this is not as promising as you believe, but they're the ones who must have conversation around it. And they're the ones who must challenge each other. Portfolio enables that conversation, but it will not conclude it.
And Bruno, I want to hold you to maybe again a specific experience rather than the general principle. And
Mm.
can you give an example of a situation where, based on this portfolio view, saying no to a few initiatives was more intelligent, even though the initiatives themselves, they sounded attractive?
Yeah, I'll give you two examples. One example was about portfolio disbalance. So this is different industry. A business unit, they had the mandate for what they called radical innovation. So they set out to make a portfolio, as I described, mapped everything. And then it turned out of all their initiatives, they had zero radical innovation initiatives. And this caused huge trouble. So there was a big argument about not how do we now invest in radical innovation, but how do we redefine portfolio definitions so that we move everything to appear as to be radical. So this is, I would say, almost a negative example, what can be brought up. And this is the downside of political nature of large organizations. But that's why I also stress, when you have this portfolio view, it can trigger the conversation, but it cannot conclude. Now, another example, more positive, and this was the industrial conglomerate. They had, again, this portfolio, they had different desired balance, and they could see that the ideas that they were putting the money in, they were mostly concentrated along the core axis. So what they did is they gathered all those determined as core, and they looked at them and they asked all of them, not asked, they challenged them. Like, can you think bigger? Can you think broader? So they didn't force them, but they said like, listen, your ideas are cool. They're interesting, but what we are interested as the ones with resources and the ones with innovation budget, we are interested in entering new markets. We are interested in serving new products to existing markets. So can you explore that as part of your initiatives and see if there's an opportunity there to capture? So they influenced, they went back to the innovators and they challenged them, and it worked. Not all of them moved, but I think it was, if I remember by heart, 4. So 4 initiatives were able to identify bigger opportunities that they initially thought were possible because the growth board looked at a portfolio and then went back to the innovators and asked them. So they did not try to invent it themselves. They went to people that are innovating and influenced them. That is a good example of using portfolios.
What is the second example?
That was the second example. First example
was the second one already?
Yeah. The first one was the bad one. Remember the transformational one. First example was in the industry where company had a portfolio and they said that they're for radical innovation, but they had zero initiatives in radical. That started the conversation around why don't we have anything there? And that resulted with, we need to redefine what radical is. So that's what I say, a bad example of that concluding. A good example is what I shared a moment ago, where
Okay, gotcha. It wasn't entirely clear for me that there was actually a second narrative starting. Bruno, I have another question. We were talking a lot about innovation, and in my mind, I was always wondering, how do you differentiate between innovation and R&D? Maybe there is an R&D department, and then there's obviously also strategic venture funding or venture investing, where large companies invest in startups who may also improve their service or product offering. How do you differentiate these different concepts?
Okay. So there are 3 things here: innovation and R&D. Grossly simplistic, but correct differentiation is R&D, you put money in, you get ideas out. Innovation, you put ideas in, you get money out. That's it. Now, what happens is that in some organizations, R&D and innovation are basically merged together. So R&D is usually responsible for both of these processes. And a good signal is if you hear, we must commercialize our R&D. So if R&D is also responsible for commercialization of their output, they're actually both doing R&D and innovation. But this is the core difference between these two processes. R&D produces ideas, innovation transforms ideas into money. That's pretty much it. I see you're thinking, You want to follow up, or should I answer the venture one as well?
Let's stick with this for one moment. I'm wondering a little bit if this is like a linear process, or alternatively, if innovation can exist without R&D.
It's not a linear process. Innovation can exist without R&D. R&D can exist without innovation. And that often happens. You might have companies that are purely into R&D space where they're producing intellectual property, which then they are licensing. You might see this, for example, well, it's not anymore, but Rimac cars, which produces that electric super fast car. In their initial years, they were basically developing very high spec components, which then they were licensing. So they had this R&D, and then they were creating patents, which then they licensed further on. And then you have you have companies that are building on R&D of other companies and are innovating. A good example would be banks. So banks usually do not develop banking protocols, payment protocols, etc., but they are building products on top of that infrastructure that somebody else has developed. They're commercializing that by introducing different types of products and services, which are in essence innovations. So they have created additional value, etc. Neither of those are linear. R&D is not linear. Innovation is not linear. But when we describe something simply, there's always a risk of perceiving them as such. Why this is a useful distinction is because it helps position the function within the organization. It sets the expectations. You're dealing with innovation. Well, what's your job? Well, my job is to transform all these ideas into new value for our customers and for our company. R&D was my job. My job is to come up with cool new stuff using bleeding edge technology, bleeding edge methods, and maybe even create bleeding edge technology and bleeding edge methods. They might or might not be commercially viable. So for R&D, in my opinion, to really be pushing the boundaries, they shouldn't be burdened by necessarily commercial viability of every invention they come up. Of course, it's nice, it's important, but sometimes we cannot just think about, is this going to be profitable or not? Sometimes we have to think about, how do we solve this differently? Or what can we do with this material? And that was a good example. What was that now? 20 years ago, when a lot of people were talking about graphene. I don't know if you remember, but it was like a specific sort of material, and there was all these crazy ideas. We're gonna make cars out of graphene. It's going to be superconductor. None of that has really happened, but that's okay. That was R&D. It was figuring out, how do we develop this high-end material, and when it's developed, then it can go to innovation. And some might argue that this is not really a productive or efficient, but so what? I mean, human creativity is not always efficient, but we have created many amazing stuff. There has to be some inefficiencies because we have to go through all these dead ends, these explorations. We have to reach the walls so we can circumvent them, we can go back, and we can discover things. And if you look at the history of innovation, there are these rediscoveries where we rediscover things again and again and again. That is an inefficiency, but it is, I guess, part of our human.
And in what you described, where does then corporate venture investing come in?
That is separate from those two. Those two are, in my opinion, core functions of organization. Venture investing is just one of innovation tactics or innovation vehicles, how some call them. So you have corporate venturing, open innovation, innovation accelerators, incubators, sprints, labs, etc. All of these are forms of specific innovation vehicles. What is maybe more interesting is that the bigger the organization is, the more vehicles it will have. And that is good. What is important is to have one strategy, one either innovation strategy or business strategy, whatever company calls it, but many vehicles, and they should be aligned. So if strategy says this, vehicles need to be supporting it. Open innovation, startup partnering, venture, CVC, corporate venture capital, etc. I have seen, pretty much every organization I work with had multiple, and each one of those had different responsibilities. So CVC was looking for things to invest in, both for future technological acquisition, but also for branding purposes. We are a company, we are an innovative company, we are supporting the ecosystem. Then they had a strategic partnership program where they were actively investing in developing startups in the ecosystem. There was no direct decision already. Are we going to acquire these startups? Are we going to be their customers? Are they going to be our customers? But they were related to the same space that the company was in. So again, they send it primarily as a sort of branding exercise. They might lead to technological acquisition. Then there was a lot of open innovation as well, which was mostly co-opetition, collaborating with supply chain partners. And then, of course, then their internal efforts, which for them was a mix of accelerators, incubators, innovation teams, etc. So venture capital that you mentioned in corporate context, it's one of the innovation vehicles. R&D and innovation as functional processes, they are for value creation.
Now, Bruno, I believe we have covered quite a lot of ground already. And if you had to distill the judgment at the heart of this into 2 or 3 things that you think are most essential for also how your mind works when you assess whether an organization can create and govern real innovation or not, and what would these things be?
Okay. I will speak for leader because leader perspective and leaders have the highest possible impact on making the organization more innovative. So I will share from that perspective. Number 1 is clarity of strategic direction. Let me explain. Leaders' responsibility is to be able to clearly say to the rest of the organization, these are the customers we are serving, this is what we're offering them, and this is where we want to go next. A lot of leaders believe they did so, but whenever I go into company and I survey employees, etc., everybody gives a different answer. When people give different answers, that means that sufficient clarity has not been reached. And without that clarity, you as a leader will continue to be frustrated by your people because they will keep bringing ideas that are not fit. That's not their fault. It is the fault of the leaders for failing to state and communicate this directly. This doesn't have to be a 300-page strategy document. It can be simple statements about customers and what we offer. Not at the level of PR talk, but specific, honest talk. But the second thing, what we discussed, well, I think we discussed it extensively. The second thing for the leaders is if you want to increase innovation performance of your organization, what you really want to focus on is the environment itself and not superstar individuals. What I mean by environment is what Florian and I have been discussing for the past hour or so, and that is enabling your innovators to propose ideas that are relevant for the strategy by you being clear, enabling your innovators to access the right people and the right resources when they have ideas, and enabling your innovators to question everything, including customer processes, etc. This sounds simple, but it's difficult to pull off in the practice. And this brings me to the third point. As a leader, all of these things, you have to embody them. What I mean by embody is not just leading by example, but actually showing that through your physical presence, not through emails, notes, memos, notats, video calls, etc., but by actually being present at the relevant arenas where innovation is happening currently in your organization and showing this curiosity yourself, asking, inquiring, not just advocating and making a decision. Yes, your job as a senior leader is to make decisions, but your job as a senior leader is also to develop your people enough so they can make most of the decisions for you already. I think this would be the 3 things that I would really focus on that's possible to get started with today without getting bogged into, is it this vehicle? Is it that innovation vehicle? Is it this tool? Is it that tool? It's more about posture, position, and I think you mentioned it, Florian, like how to think, cognitive orientation.
Wisdom and experience are obviously earned, and you've been in this line of business for quite some time. What did you believe about innovation and leadership in innovation, let's say 10 years ago? versus now? How has this changed? Where were you most wrong early on?
One of the pivotal moments in my career happened early on. I was working as an engineer. I was developing a freight train. I was not alone. I was in a team of engineers, and we were all super enthusiastic. We were all relatively fresh out of university, and we had access to modern simulation software, etc. So we had a customer that came, and they asked for a product that they believed was impossible to make, like physically impossible to make. And we took that as a personal challenge, we will make it real. And we spent like 3 weeks, 24/7 designing that, making prototypes in the facility, etc. And freight trains are pretty big, but it comes down to, sheets of metal that are welded together. That's what it is. So we kind of designed a freight train that fit the specification, the purpose, after 3 weeks. It was a nightmare. Then what came as a shock to me, and this was product that was the best in the market at that moment. The customer did not believe it. Nobody in the market believed that this was possible. And we couldn't sell it. We couldn't sell it for 2 years. The best product, most innovative product. And to me, that was mind blowing. Like, wow, why is this happening? And this set me off on a long inquiry why is this not enough? If this is technologically the best product, it satisfies all the requirements the customer said, not satisfies, it over delivers. Why are people not jumping at the opportunity? And this helped me realize early on, and I'm very grateful for that, is that succeeding with innovation is not just about technological side. It is also about how people talk about value, how they perceive value, how they speak about these innovations. Because a lot of these innovations, they spread in the market, not just because of their technical prowess, but because how people perceive them, how they tell each other, how they promote it to each other. And we as innovators, we control only part of that story. So I'm very grateful. It was hurting the ego at that time, but today I'm very grateful for that experience, because I realized, oh wow, innovation is not just about, technical people, about being the smartest in the room, but it's actually about understanding the whole big picture, like what motivates people to buy, what is the underlying issue, what are the underlying outcomes that they're desiring, how are they satisfying them, how does this fit in the big picture, how do people in organization actually learn that, how do they mediate that, how do they create something customers will react to, how do they get internal support for that. Hundreds of questions were launched by this realization. What is it now, 13, 14 years ago?
Now, Bruno, let's slowly but steadily start wrapping up our conversation for today. We did cover quite a few aspects. And out of everything we have discussed today, what are you most grateful for in your life at this moment, not limited to your professional work?
Well, I'm very grateful for I'm very grateful for my parents, I would say, because I had the good fortune of being a curious kid, and I had the good fortune of not having that, eradicated. I was always encouraged by my parents to remain curious, to remain questioning, etc. And I know this might sound maybe mundane, but when I reflect on my life and when I reflect on a lot of my friends, etc., I cannot help but notice that, this curiosity and everything was slowly, suppressed by the environment, often accidentally, not really deliberately, like they were punished or something, but more like, you go to school, you learn, like, this is the box, this is the form, you follow that, you follow that, you follow that, you stop being curious about your environment. And I remain curious, and I find it helps me immensely in my professional and personal life. It brings me joy, and I'm very grateful that, I had the good fortune of having parents that encouraged that and allowed me and enabled me to remain curious, even as I get gray hairs and become older and older.
That sounds very powerful. And I'm wondering if Maybe the answer to my next question is a little bit similar, but we have this tradition on the podcast, and I'd like to ask you, is there someone or something that is inspiring you right now? Maybe a leader, a book, an idea, maybe your
Hmm.
parent, anything else that's giving you energy that you would like to share with our audience?
Let's start professional and then move into more personal. So professionally, like I like to read a lot. I think written word is very good because somebody went the effort to write something, and they put in, even if I don't agree with it 100%, they put in their experience. So we can go and we can see if it resonates, what doesn't, we can reflect on it. Think of podcasts in a similar way. Like there
Mhm.
is a person who is sharing their experience and there's a host who is guiding the conversation. So you have an opportunity to reflect on that. When it comes to inspiration, this is a little bit painted with my focus on the last couple of years as I've been, in addition to working, I've been diving into research on,
Mhm.
innovation and what makes innovation work. But it's not innovation writing that has been inspiring me. It has actually been writing on how people work together that I found most inspiration in. And one of the authors I have greatly enjoyed is John Heron. So if you look up Facilitator's Handbook, Cooperative Inquiry, and these terms, you will find this author. He passed away several years ago. Most of his work he made available before he passed away because they're difficult to get in print, but at least you can get PDF and print it yourself. What really inspires me is how he went really, really deep in how people come together to work. And he writes about it in such a practical way. So he was a practical person and he has all these frames and mental models and tools. And to give you an example, he writes, when we come together, we basically engage in three different ways. It might be what he calls hierarchical, like one of us takes the
Mhm.
lead and everybody else follows. And remember, he doesn't paint any of this as good or bad, which is also what I love. Then he calls it like distributed or democratic or whatever, where everybody has the same say. So we come together and he's like, Florian, what do you think? Bruno, what do you think? And we go in the circle and we make. And then he has this, what he calls cooperative or participatory, where we kind of go and join hands and try to have the mix of this hierarchical and democratic process. Again, he doesn't paint any of those as good or bad, but he provides this model with different stages, planning, execution,
Mhm.
reflection, etc. And to me, that was like mind blowing because like I was able to reflect on all my years of experience working with companies. Like, oh yeah, I mean, this is when they asked me to plan everything. That was, I was in a hierarchical position, and then when we came to develop an idea, we moved to participatory, etc. It was just fascinating because it allows you to reflect on one of the most human processes, and that is us working together. Because in organizations, it's all about us working together. Even if there's technology like AI, etc., it's still
Mhm.
us using that technology. So that is where I draw a lot of inspiration currently. And I encourage anyone who would like to read, go look it up, find it. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Personally, I mean, as I said, my family, my fiance, martial arts. I've been practicing martial arts for over 30 years now. So I find it always, invigorating and kind of it just helps with handling uncertainty because martial arts is about handling uncertainty. When you walk into the ring or walk into that sparring session, you don't know what's going to happen. You just know what you have and you have to adapt and adjust to the situation. So that's a good thing, I hope.
Now and then, Bruno, if our audience members remember just one thing from our conversation, one insight or one way of thinking differently, or even one action that they should take, what would you want that to be?
Let me think. One action, one insight. What will be most useful to start innovating is to get the idea out of your head. You cannot innovate alone. You need to get into the room with other people, colleagues, peers, etc., and you need to expose your idea to others. That is most fundamental first step you can take and connect it to everything we have discussed. Florian and I have discussed earlier on this podcast, because really everything flows from that. If you keep ideas in your head, I promise you they will never get anywhere. If you put them out there, they might be shut down, but that just means that you can go and have another idea. Spend ideas, not money. That is the most fundamental step you can take today. Believe me, by articulating it, it's going to get better. By keeping it in your mind, it's not going to get better unless, I guess, you're Einstein, who was famous for his thought experiments, but he also articulated them in front of others. So don't bottle it in.
Bruno Pesec, thank you very much for this conversation. It was great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.